So I've been at Cal Poly for 14 years. I was hired to teach 19th and 20th century British literature and have made my way into some of the most topically challenging courses that we offer in our department. I teach a seminar on Joyce's Ulysses, which was banned from a number of countries when it came out in 1922. I'm teaching a seminar right now on Virginia Woolf, who's an atheist. And I'm very much a Christian, but I'm teaching someone who's regularly attacking the faith. And I teach a class on Lars von Trier's films, which has visual depictions of some of the most horrible things that humans are capable of doing to one another, including murder and rape. And I teach apocalypse and dystopia, really happy kinds of narratives, right? Last quarter, in the midst of a pandemic, I was teaching Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which is about a pandemic that wipes out the planet's population. So I like to take the bull by the horns, apparently, and I'm really wanting to share with you how I've arrived at that point where in middle age, I've decided that it's not sadistic to teach this kind of material to students, but it might actually benefit them by challenging them in ways that they don't necessarily expect to be challenged in a college class. I want to start by talking about providing you a few scenes from my life, kind of get the ball rolling here. So in high school, visiting my grandmother in Missouri with my family, we decided to go down to the local video store, these things used to exist, and rent the video Flowers in the Attic, which is based on a novel about some kids that are locked up in an attic and abused and nearly starved to death by their grandmother. It was pretty horrifying stuff. And I remember emerging from that film and getting into a little bit of an altercation with my father, who thought it was basically a waste of time and meaningless trash. And I was convinced that seeing this kind of suffering had something redemptive in it, that it might help me better sympathize with others who had actually gone through such horrible things. Switch forward to to a moment in the mid-90s when I'm a high school teacher myself, teaching at a Christian school in Austin, Texas. And one of my students shares with the class that as part of his spiritual journey, he's decided he needs to get rid of all his comics and all his records, basically burn the whole thing down, these huge collections into which he'd put a ton of money. And as someone who had collected comic books himself and still was collecting comic books at the time, I didn't make any public comments, but I was thinking, wow, that's potentially quite a waste of resources. Why would you do that? And then fast forward to just a few years ago, a couple of years before the passing of my father, traveling to some relatives in Oregon, reading aloud to them a story by Flannery O'Connor entitled Good Country People, which received very different reactions from my family members. My dad thought that it sounded like soft porn, and my mom was able to see the redemptive story going on but my parents reacted in totally polarized ways to this story. So moments like these have reminded me, as if I didn't know already, that the arts can be incredibly divisive and that people are going to react very differently to the very same kinds of artifacts, whether they're visual or audio or a mixture of the two. So this is a question to ask. Should we be allowing ourselves to engage with art that is not derived directly from the Bible? Like what we were just looking at a moment ago, an image that is very moving if we recognize the older brother who's looking down sternly, probably in judgment on his young brother, one shoe off, who's huddled up close to his father. I mean, this is a portrait of the redemption story of God's love for us that is pretty easy for Christians to recognize the value of, and it has a lot of value. I'm going to be talking to you about some other forms of art that might be less directly connected to Scripture, but might also bear looking into. So the little blurb that was sent around about my presentation presented you with these two verses, which seem to push us in different directions, right? So we are told in James that with the power of God behind us, we can resist the adversary, and the adversary will flee from us. In other situations, we're told this is dangerous enough that you should flee, you should get out of Dodge, relocate yourself because this is not a healthy situation to be in. So is it just a matter of sex? Is that the only factor that we're looking at here? Or are there other ways to complicate these questions? Is it possible that sometimes it's a very good idea for me to engage with something, whereas on a different day, it would be a bad idea, given where I am in my relationship with God, or my fatigue level, or whether I'm feeling tempted by certain things, right? These are the kinds of tensions that I'd like us to talk about, and the ambiguities that we have to wrestle with the help of the Holy Spirit.
I'm not.
So obviously,
Are you screen sharing?
I am. Oh, yes. Maybe I should do that.
Sorry.
Oh, that's good. So it's obvious that we should, in certain situations, extricate ourselves from something that looks like it could be dangerous. I do not rappel down the sides of mountains or hills like, Bishop's Peak. So that is the kind of situation that I would rather avoid because I don't think I'd be safe doing it. Once you become a parent, and I have two daughters, one is a sophomore at Wheaton College in Illinois, and the other is a senior in high school who's trying to decide right now, this evening, where she's going to attend college. It becomes, a much more complicated issue, like what kinds of things are we introducing our kids to at different developmental ages? What's appropriate for them? We want to stretch them, challenge them, but not traumatize them, and how as a parent do you do this well? Obviously, there are times for anyone who is a believer and who is trying to be very conscientious about the kinds of things they allow into their imaginations, it can be a good idea to avoid certain films, certain kinds of songs, certain images, if we think that they might dance about in our minds and misbehave, right? And recognizing when we are more likely to be vulnerable to certain kinds of things is very important. It involves a degree of self-knowledge that is enviable for someone who can do this well, right? One of the things I've figured out about myself is that I'm more vulnerable to certain kinds of temptations when I am utterly exhausted or when I have a ton of grading to do. And the papers that I've read thus far, let's say, aren't brilliant. So they're not giving me, they're not stimulating me in a really good way. And my mind is, I can start to doze off, or I can start to want to gravitate towards something that's going to re-energize me, right? So those are situations in which I can be a little bit more susceptible to some kinds of things. So we are told, right, that faith, this thing on which we rest our salvation, involves belief in something we cannot see. So the degree to which we should be attuned to the invisible, to the intangible, and the degree to which we should be cognizant of what we can see and can hold in our hands is an open question. Flannery O'Connor, whom I love to teach in my Bible's literature class, which I teach most years, she argues that as a Christian, she's a Catholic, lives in Georgia in the mid-20th century. She argues that her faith actually increases her vision, that as a writer, she thinks it appropriate for her to look squarely at anything and to write about it in hopes of moving her audience towards redemption. Okay, so what should we look at? What should we not? I want to return to my personal life and share with you some rather embarrassing things. So when I was in 6th grade, I attended a very bad horror movie, we would call it a B horror film now, called Time Walker. I had no experience with horror movies. This is 6th grade. I had just moved from Washington to Tennessee, and a friend of mine wanted to take me to a movie. I was so scared by this film that I had to step outside the theater, which gave my friend ample reason to mock me in the future, right, later on that year. So this was something that was rather embarrassing and shameful. When I was in show choir, not quite so glitzy as a Glee, but that kind of thing, singing and dancing in high school, I had a not young, she was a year older than I was, but a very petite dance partner with a gorgeous voice who was a Christian. And she was small enough that little old me could throw her up in the air, right? This is an amazing combination of traits. And I fell madly in love with her. And there were times where I would sit in my living room listening over and over to romantic ballads by Richard Marx, including this one, Hold On to the Nights. And I just listened to this again a couple days ago for the first time in like a decade and cannot get it out of my head, which tells you the kind of power it wielded over me when I was younger. And it would take me into a very sorrowful place because this girl, Mindy, had a boyfriend. It wasn't the best relationship, but she was not interested in dropping him and taking up with me. So despite the fact that I, wrote her notes occasionally, made her mixtapes, was her dance partner, I would drive by her house thinking about her, and this vulnerability in the area of romance was coexisting with a very dark spiritual time for me. So I grew up in the Christian church, was baptized in middle school, but I was questioning a lot of what I believed in this year. So we have Mindy over here who's offering a certain kind of hope, a certain kind of light, and then we have my faith, which was a little bit rocky, or more than a little bit. And then as a sophomore in high school, I read Mrs. Dalloway. To the Lighthouse. I'm teaching a seminar on Wolf right now. We're wrapping up Mrs. Dalloway and about to begin this novel, which rocked my world in college because I recognized a lot of my own failings in one of the protagonists in the book. It's like having a mirror held up in front of me. And I saw his emotional neediness and the way that he was so reliant on having a woman affirm him repeatedly. And I saw these tendencies in myself. And in the book, I saw the ways in which this relationship had fractured his connection to his kids and actually drained the energy out of his wife, right, who dies prematurely in the book. Now, one could look at this horror film or any of the others that I've seen since and argue that why would you want to induce some kind of fear state in you, right? We are encouraged to not be afraid, to put our trust in the Lord, right? And thinking about, Richard Marx and Hold On to the Nights, my hope, most definitely, as a Christian, I know my hope should not be in a woman, in the possibility of an intimate connection there, an emotional connection. And yet I'm experiencing this thing. Were these bad experiences for me to go through? The idea of marriage as being something that pulls people into one entity, not just, the whole one flesh thing is not just about sex. It's about two people who start to work together as a unit, right? As a team moving forward. Was it a bad idea for me to allow myself to be scared, to hope for something that seemed out of reach, to look squarely at a marriage that is on the rocks, at a very negative example of marriage? Does this have any redemptive value? Well, this film, I think, helped me, a middle-class white boy living in a rather heterogeneous part of Washington in the middle of the state. I did not know what it was like to experience fear, relatively speaking. I had not gone through a lot of the experiences that many of our brothers and sisters in Christ who live in, say, urban inner city areas might go through. And this horror film taught me what it's like to be debilitated, to be frozen by fear. An alien, yes, right? An alien who inhabits the body of a pharaoh or something who's mummified. A very fantastic situation. And yet it taught me what it feels like to be afraid, right? Which gives me the ability to actually perhaps move forward in step with someone else, to walk alongside them when they are afraid of something that I don't fully understand, but I know what it's like to feel this overwhelming emotion. And to emerge from the other side, recognizing that God's love for me is strong enough to conquer any kind of fear. So, but having had that experience with fear allowed me to understand what that even that verse even means. If you haven't experienced fear of some sort, even an imaginative kind like that, it's very difficult to embrace the idea that God can conquer your fear. And, experiencing this romantic obsession Was it good? I don't know that it was the most emotionally healthy thing for me, but it helped me understand that this kind of emotion can be incredibly powerful. It told me what to look out for once I was in college, and I was a little bit more serious about looking for romance. I actually ended up marrying my girlfriend from college, married 26 years, and it's pretty amazing. This, I realized with Mindy, the dance partner, that part of what I was longing for was the fact that she was out of reach. This is so horrible. Once I had a chance with her, I lost interest, right? I remember a night where we shared a lot about our experiences, our families. We pulled out our scrapbooks and we're sharing a lot. And I still liked her. I was still interested in her, but the edge of my interest was worn down by familiarity. And I realized that much of what I had been desiring was a fabrication of my own fancy, right? It was something that did not exist. So that helped me moving into a real relationship a couple of years later to know what to look for in myself and to find my hope ultimately not in the perfect match who, to quote Jerry Maguire, is going to complete me, right? But to instead find fulfillment somewhere else, in someone else who knows me fully. And To the Lighthouse, like many other books that I teach my students at Cal Poly, provides lots of negative examples to avoid if you're ever going to be in a serious relationship with someone, like Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, or George Eliot's Middlemarch, or The Awakening by Kate Chopin. So many examples of what not to do. And this is one of the reasons I teach literature, is because I feel that it can hold up a mirror to us and help us to course correct and maybe avoid some measure of pain. And of course, we know that, as the perfect symbol of a spouse, in metaphorical language, that Christ waits for us to sacrifice himself, as he's already done and continues to do. This love, which gives everything, right, gives us a model as spouses of how to love someone else more perfectly. So we have the Holy Spirit, right, which is helping to give us advice when we are in difficult situations. Should I step into this bar? Is it okay for me to have a drink in this situation, given who's around and who knows me and what they're watching and what they're going to assume about my actions? Is it appropriate for me to have students over and watch a certain kind of film in my garage and talk about this film? Am I going to lead somebody in a direction which is possibly unhealthy for them spiritually? Is it going to be a challenging film? Can they grow through this? Will I help them grow through the discussion that follows the film? These are questions I'm constantly asking of myself. And here's a big one. So 1 Corinthians 13, the definition of love starts out with, once it gets to the love part, love is patient, love is kind. Now, how do we actually show patience or kindness towards someone whom we do not understand? I think it's very difficult. There is a measure of virtue that relies on experience, whether it's embodied experience or imaginative. And art can help us to experience things in our imaginations and thus step into the position of someone else whose feet, whose shoes we have not actually walked in before. So what should this faith resemble? Should we erect walls around ourselves, right? Some people think of their faith as a barrier. I actually ran into some adults, this married couple at Grace Bible Church, where I attend in AG, a few years ago, who were intent on relocating their family to Idaho into the middle of nowhere in order to protect their kids from adverse cultural influences. I kid you not. They were very serious about this, and they disappeared within a year. So I'm assuming they followed through. Should we consider faith as, in a natural way, something that is very comforting to us, that does not ever challenge us, that does not make us uncomfortable, that provides solace and respite? Is faith a telescope that allows us to examine reality from a distance without actually risking anything on our own, without getting too close to that which might discomfit us? Is it a bathtub or a hot spring that surrounds us with cleansing water, which warms and comforts us? I mean, those of us who are enamored of the process of baptism, well, not the baptisms my daughters have had, because they got baptized in the ocean nearby, which is incredibly cold. But it is possible to be baptized in comforting water. So a few different images, but I think that St. Paul, the apostle, gives us a great one when he talks in Ephesians 6 about the shield of faith. Right now, when he wrote this, there were a couple of different kinds of shields that he could have had in mind. Right? There's the Mycenaean shield, which is a bit of a figure 8, but he is living in a Roman occupied area, right? So we have a few other possibilities. We have the Greek aspis, which pre-existed the Roman occupation, and then we have, this kind of shield, which basically looks like a wall. When Paul says that faith should be a shield, does he have a particular type of shield in mind? I'm not going to show you the full clip I have here, but to just give you an idea of how aspis we use, we have, Eric Brana and what's his face, Brad Pitt, looking it out in this particular scene from a film where the aspis is incredibly versatile and easy to move, right? Which is very different from what we see in this scene from Gladiator. See if it's even going to show up, and it's not. Oh my goodness. You know what? I checked this right before, and it worked. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But what we see in this scene is that the good guys who are trying to protect one another and survive, the gladiators, basically use the scotum to erect a wall around themselves, and they can peer out from it, but they're creating a wall in front of them, to the sides, and above them to protect themselves from the flaming darts and other kinds of things that are coming at them. So, what should our particular faith look like? What shape should our shield take, right? How do we use our faith? I think this is a question that you can consider in your breakout rooms. Do I allow my faith to empower me? Do I move forward in confidence, holding my shield, but not obscuring my vision? Like, do I hold it above my face so that I can't see what's in front of me, so that I can't understand whatever adversity that I'm facing, or understand the suffering that someone else is going through next to me? Do I look over the edge? Just to mix things up even more, I'm going to jump forward to a few modern forms of armor. So here we have a couple scenes from The Walking Dead, which in that apocalypse and dystopia class I was talking about before. Here we have a character who's wearing body armor. His entire body is sheathed with something that the zombies can't bite through, right? And it gives him a lot of mobility, but it protects all of him. And he even has a visor that he pulls down over his helmet. And then we have, the kind of shield that can be actually used as a projectile, right? So do we want to weaponize our faith? I mean, I love Captain America, but this is not the kind of shield I think about when I think about faith, right? Something that is extended outwards and actually used to strike. You may not know who Invisible Woman is, but let me tell you, within the next decade, you will, because Marvel, which now has the rights to the Fantastic Four once again, and the X-Men, is going to do films concerning the Fantastic Four. And Invisible Woman here is able to create a transparent barrier around herself. So she has a 360-degree view of everything surrounding her, but she's protected, right? So what I want to leave you with is this question of what shape should our faith take? What do we allow ourselves to encounter? And I'm not going to spell it out to you. I'm not going to give you a list or talk about a rating system or anything like that. I think that what's most important is that we are constantly calling on the Holy Spirit to help us understand ourselves, to understand our strengths and weaknesses in particular situations, and asking honestly for wisdom, for discernment in making decisions. Always knowing that we have this shield which God has provided, but it's not, I would argue, intended to obscure our vision of reality, right? But to actually empower us to move forward in faith so that we can better understand what others are going through and thus be able to respond to them with patience and kindness that is real and vital and life-changing. So there you have it. It's about a half hour. So the questions for breakout rooms, I would suggest, how do you envision your own faith as a shield? And maybe you can talk about specific examples of things that have proven to be challenging at first, certain kinds of the arts like television, film, paintings, music, whatever, that were challenging, but ended up making you stronger or more resilient, or expanding your sympathy, your understanding of what others are going through. And if anybody wants to go there, they could talk about bad choices they made, with the arts. So there we go. Some discussion questions to consider.
That's great. Thank you so much for your talk. That was wonderful. Yeah, so we will transition into a time of discussion.